In the past 2 decades, something remarkable has been unfolding across the African continent that echoes one of history's most exploitative periods, yet looks fundamentally different in its execution. While Western nations debate the ethics of their colonial past, China has become Africa's largest trading partner, largest infrastructure financier, and, in many countries, the most visible foreign presence. The parallels to the 19th century scramble for Africa are impossible to ignore, but so are the differences, and understanding both is crucial to grasping what's actually happening on the ground today. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Now, I need to be upfront about something before we begin. This topic is extraordinarily complex, and I'm approaching it as someone who has spent considerable time researching contemporary African politics and economic development. But I'm acutely aware that this is an ongoing situation with perspectives that vary dramatically depending on where you're standing. African voices on this issue are diverse and often contradictory, which itself tells us something important. What I'm offering here is an analysis based on the best available research, scholarly work, and reporting, while acknowledging that we're essentially trying to understand a historical process while we're still living through it. This isn't a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It's a story about power, resources, development models, and the legacy of colonialism intersecting with the realities of 21st century geopolitics. So here's what we're going to explore. The current scramble for influence in Africa isn't just a replay of the 19th century with new players. It represents something more nuanced, a collision between different development philosophies, competing visions of global order, and African nations increasingly asserting their own agency in ways that complicate the narrative of external domination. We're going to look at how this new scramble actually works, what distinguishes Chinese engagement from Western approaches, what the historical parallels reveal and conceal, and ultimately, what this means for African sovereignty and development in the coming decades. Let's begin with understanding the sheer scale of what we're talking about. When we say China has become Africa's largest trading partner, we need to grasp what that actually means in concrete terms. According to data from the China-Africa Research Initiative at Johns Hopkins University, Chinese-African trade exceeded $254 billion in 2021, a figure that has grown from just $10 billion in 2000. To put that in perspective, that's roughly a 2,400% increase in 2 decades. China has provided more than $153 billion in loans to African governments and state-owned enterprises between 2000 and 2019, primarily for infrastructure projects. We're talking about ports in Djibouti, railways in Kenya and Ethiopia, hydroelectric dams across multiple countries, telecommunications networks, highways, and entire special economic zones modeled on China's own development approach. But here's where things get interesting and where we need to resist simplistic narratives. Western countries haven't been sitting idle during this period. The United States has maintained significant aid programs through PEPFAR and the Millennium Challenge Corporation. European nations have continued development assistance and trade relationships built over decades. And institutions like the World Bank and IMF remain major players in African economies. What's changed isn't Western disengagement. It's the emergence of an alternative model that African leaders can play off against traditional Western relationships. This competition for influence is the scramble, and it's being conducted primarily through infrastructure deals, resource extraction agreements, and competing visions of what development should look like. The historical parallel to the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 is instructive, but only up to a point. During that infamous gathering, European powers literally divided Africa among themselves on maps, with zero African representation, establishing colonial boundaries that still cause conflict today. The current situation is fundamentally different in one crucial respect. African nations are negotiating these deals themselves. Presidents and prime ministers are making strategic choices about which partners to work with, playing Chinese offers against Western conditions, and increasingly demanding better terms as they've learned how much leverage they actually possess. Scholars like Howard French, whose book China's Second Continent extensively documents Chinese engagement in Africa, notes that African agency is far greater than most Western commentaries acknowledge. These aren't passive victims being colonized. They're strategic actors making calculated decisions, even if those decisions sometimes come with problematic consequences. China's approach is radically different. The principle of non-interference in internal affairs is central to Chinese foreign policy, rooted in the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, articulated by Zhou Enlai in 1954. When China offers financing for a massive infrastructure project, it typically doesn't come with demands for democratic reforms or human rights improvements. Chinese officials consistently frame their engagement as South-South cooperation between developing nations, emphasizing mutual benefit and respect for sovereignty. Deborah Brautigam, director of the China-Africa Research Initiative and one of the foremost scholars on this topic, has extensively documented how this no-strings-attached approach appeals enormously to African leaders tired of being lectured by former colonial powers about how to run their countries. However, and this is important, the debt trap narrative itself has been challenged by recent research. Brautigam and Meg Rithmeyer published a comprehensive analysis in 2020 examining the actual evidence for systematic Chinese debt trap diplomacy, and found it largely unsupported by the data. They discovered that Chinese lenders have frequently renegotiated debt terms, extended payment schedules, and in some cases, forgiven debt entirely rather than seizing assets. The Hambantota port case, they argue, was more complex than typically portrayed, involving Sri Lankan domestic politics and strategic decisions that can't be reduced to Chinese predation. This doesn't mean Chinese lending is without problems or risks. It means we need to be more precise about what those problems actually are, rather than relying on simplistic narratives. What's particularly interesting is how African negotiating positions have evolved over time. Early Chinese deals in the 2000s often heavily favored Chinese interests, with terms that African governments later came to view as problematic. But as African officials gained experience and compared notes with their counterparts in other countries, they began pushing back and demanding better terms. Ghana's renegotiation of the Sino-Hydro Master Facility Agreement in 2018 is a case in point. The government successfully revised terms it deemed too favorable to Chinese interests. Tanzania, under President John Magufuli, took a notably harder line with Chinese investors, canceling or renegotiating several deals that previous administrations had signed. These examples demonstrate that African agency isn't just theoretical, it's actively being exercised, and the power dynamics are more fluid than simplistic narratives suggest. Chinese construction firms, often state-owned enterprises, can mobilize massive resources quickly and complete projects at speeds that astonish Western observers. The Addis Ababa to Djibouti Railway, a 750-kilometer electric railway completed in 2016, took just 4 years to build at a cost of $4 billion. Primarily Chinese-financed and constructed by Chinese firms with Chinese materials and Chinese workers. Compare that to the typical timeline for a major infrastructure project funded by Western institutions, which might take a decade or more from planning to completion, and you begin to understand the appeal. African leaders can point to tangible accomplishments within their political lifetimes, within their terms in office, which matters enormously for domestic legitimacy. The sheer variety of Chinese projects across Africa tells us something about the scale of this engagement. In Ghana, Chinese firms built the Brautigam, providing electricity to thousands. In Tanzania, the port of Bagamoyo was planned as a massive container terminal, though the project has faced delays and renegotiations. The African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa itself was built and fully financed by China as a gift, a powerful symbol of Chinese-African partnership, though it later became controversial when reports emerged of surveillance equipment allegedly installed in the building. In Nigeria, Chinese companies have been involved in railway modernization projects connecting major cities. These aren't just infrastructure projects. They're reshaping the physical landscape of the continent and creating new economic corridors that will influence trade patterns for generations. But this speed comes with trade-offs that we need to examine honestly. Chinese projects have faced criticism for environmental impacts, inadequate labor protections, and sometimes shoddy construction that requires expensive repairs within years. The Standard Gauge Railway in Kenya, another flagship Chinese project, has been plagued by operational difficulties and questions about whether the economic benefits justify the debt burden. There are also concerns about the lack of technology transfer. Chinese firms typically import their own workers for skilled positions and use Chinese materials rather than training local workers or sourcing locally, which limits the spillover benefits for African economies. The labor issue deserves particular attention because it gets at something fundamental about different development models. Western-funded projects typically require local hiring and capacity building as part of their mandates, the goal being not just to build infrastructure, but to develop local skills and industries in the process. Chinese firms argue that their approach gets projects done faster and more efficiently, which is true, but critics counter that this creates dependence rather than sustainable development. Deborah Brautigam's research shows that the reality is more mixed than either purely positive or negative accounts suggest. Some Chinese firms have indeed engaged in significant local hiring and training, while others have operated more as enclaves with minimal local integration. The variation suggests that the problem isn't inherently Chinese involvement, but rather the specific terms of individual deals and the capacity of African governments to negotiate favorable conditions. This brings us to the question of African agency, which I mentioned earlier but want to explore more thoroughly. One of the most problematic aspects of much Western commentary on Chinese engagement in Africa is the tendency to portray African leaders and populations as passive dupes being exploited by a new imperial power. This narrative, ironically, reproduces the same paternalistic attitudes that characterized European colonialism. African leaders are making strategic choices, sometimes good ones and sometimes terrible ones, but choices nonetheless. Countries like Ethiopia, under Prime Minister Meles Zenawi, explicitly studied the Chinese development model and attempted to adapt elements of it to their own context. Rwanda's Paul Kagame has similarly looked to Chinese-style state-led development, while maintaining relationships with Western donors. These leaders aren't being tricked. They're selecting from available options based on their own assessments of their country's needs and interests. What's particularly interesting is how African negotiating positions have evolved over time. Early Chinese deals in the 2000s often heavily favored Chinese interests, with terms that African governments later came to view as problematic. But as African officials gained experience and compared notes with their counterparts in other countries, they began pushing back and demanding better terms. Ghana's renegotiation of the Sino-Hydro Master Facility Agreement in 2018 is a case in point. The government successfully revised terms it deemed too favorable to Chinese interests. Tanzania, under President John Magufuli, took a notably harder line with Chinese investors, canceling or renegotiating several deals that previous administrations had signed. These examples demonstrate that African agency isn't just theoretical, it's actively being exercised, and the power dynamics are more fluid than simplistic narratives suggest. Moreover, we need to acknowledge the diversity of African responses to Chinese engagement. Some countries, like Djibouti, have embraced Chinese investment so thoroughly that they've become almost entirely dependent on it, with Chinese loans accounting for a staggering percentage of their GDP. Others, like Botswana, have been far more cautious, carefully evaluating each proposal and maintaining diversified partnerships. South Africa's relationship with China is particularly complex, simultaneously competitive and cooperative, as both countries are major players in African affairs. This variation reflects different political systems, resource endowments, existing relationships with Western powers, and strategic calculations by individual leaders. The resource question is absolutely central to understanding the new scramble. And here, the parallels to 19th century colonialism are most direct. Africa holds vast reserves of minerals essential to modern technology: cobalt for batteries, rare earth elements for electronics, copper, oil, natural gas, and increasingly important resources like lithium. China's industrial economy requires massive inputs of these resources, and securing reliable access has been a strategic priority. But again, the mechanism is different from colonial extraction. These are negotiated deals where African governments receive revenue, even if the terms are often unfavorable and the environmental costs are borne locally while the benefits flow elsewhere. It's worth noting that Western companies have been extracting African resources for over a century and continue to do so. The difference is that China's entry has created competition that gives African nations more bargaining power than they had when Western firms were the only game in town. Let's talk about the geopolitical dimension, because this scramble isn't happening in a vacuum. The United States and European powers have watched China's growing influence in Africa with increasing alarm, leading to new Western initiatives designed to counter Chinese engagement. The U.S. Build Act of 2018 created the Development Finance Corporation to compete with Chinese infrastructure financing. The European Union's Global Gateway Initiative, launched in 2021, promises €300 billion in infrastructure investment globally, with a significant focus on Africa. The G7's Build Back Better World Partnership though it struggled to get off the ground, represents another attempt to offer an alternative to Chinese financing. These initiatives essentially acknowledge that China has changed the game, and Western powers need to adapt or lose influence. This competition has benefits and drawbacks for African nations. On the positive side, competition between external powers gives African governments leverage to negotiate better terms. If Western donors won't finance a port project without extensive conditions, African leaders can turn to China for alternative financing. This dynamic has already led to Western institutions relaxing some conditions and speeding up approval processes. On the negative side, this great power competition risks reducing African nations to proxies in larger geopolitical struggles, particularly as US-China tensions intensify. We're already seeing this in battles over telecommunications infrastructure, with the US pressuring African countries not to use Huawei equipment for 5G networks, while China offers attractive financing packages for Huawei systems. The COVID-19 pandemic added new dimensions to this competition. China's vaccine diplomacy, providing doses when Western vaccines were scarce in Africa, contrasted with what many Africans perceived as vaccine hoarding by wealthy Western nations. Chinese medical teams arrived in African countries early in the pandemic, building on decades of Chinese medical cooperation in Africa that predates the current infrastructure boom. These soft power initiatives matter enormously for how Chinese engagement is perceived on the ground, often more than the big infrastructure projects that dominate Western media coverage. But we also need to talk about the pushback that's emerging in some African countries against Chinese engagement. There have been protests in Zambia over Chinese labor practices, controversies in Kenya over the terms of railway financing, concerns in multiple countries about Chinese firms bringing in workers rather than hiring locally, and growing awareness of the debt burdens some countries are accumulating. This pushback demonstrates that African populations are not passive observers, but active participants in shaping how external engagement plays out. The fact that these debates are happening, that African civil society groups are demanding greater transparency and better terms, is itself a form of agency that complicates any simple narrative of Chinese domination. Civil society organizations across Africa have become increasingly sophisticated in monitoring and critiquing Chinese engagement. Groups like the African Forum and Network on Debt and Development track lending terms and advocate for debt transparency. Environmental organizations have documented the impacts of Chinese mining and infrastructure projects, forcing both African governments and Chinese firms to respond to public pressure. Labor unions have organized workers in Chinese-owned factories and construction sites, sometimes successfully negotiating better conditions. This grassroots activism represents a crucial check on both Chinese and Western engagement, ensuring that development doesn't happen purely on terms set by external powers or unaccountable elites. What makes this moment different from the 19th century Scramble, fundamentally, is that African nations are independent states with sovereignty, however limited by economic realities, rather than territories to be conquered and divided. The agency question is real and important. Yes, economic desperation and the legacy of underdevelopment limit the choices available to African governments. Yes, corruption and authoritarian tendencies in some governments lead to deals that benefit elites rather than populations. But these are internal political problems that existed before Chinese engagement intensified and would persist even without it. The task for African nations is figuring out how to leverage external engagement, whether Chinese or Western, or from other partners like India, Turkey, or Gulf states, to serve genuine development goals rather than elite enrichment. Scholars like Yun Sun at the Stimson Center have documented how African countries are becoming more sophisticated in their engagement with China, learning from each other's experiences, sharing information about problematic practices, and increasingly driving harder bargains. The African Union itself has become more active in setting frameworks for external engagement, though implementation remains uneven across member states. This evolution suggests that the current phase may be transitional, a period of learning and adaptation as African nations figure out how to navigate between competing external powers while advancing their own development agendas. All in all, the new Scramble for Africa is neither a simple repetition of colonial exploitation nor a benign partnership of equals. It's a complex, evolving situation where historical legacies, contemporary power dynamics, resource politics, and genuine development needs intersect in ways that produce different outcomes in different contexts. China's rise as a major player in Africa has undeniably changed the landscape, offering alternatives to Western dominance while also creating new forms of dependency and risk. Western powers are responding with their own initiatives, sometimes driven more by geopolitical competition than genuine development goals. And African nations are navigating these dynamics with varying degrees of success, constrained by real limitations but also exercising real agency. The question of whether this represents a new form of colonialism or a genuine development partnership can't be answered with a simple yes or no, because the answer varies by country, by sector, by specific project. What we can say is that the outcomes will be determined as much by African choices and institutions as by Chinese or Western policies. The infrastructure being built today will shape African economies for decades. The debt being accumulated will affect fiscal policy for a generation, and the precedents being set for resource extraction and environmental protection will have long-lasting consequences. Those of us watching from outside can analyze and critique, but ultimately, the people living with these consequences, ordinary Africans, will determine whether the current scramble produces genuine development or just new forms of exploitation. Anyway, I want to hear from you all, especially those of you from African countries or who have direct experience with these issues. How do you see the current dynamics of external engagement in Africa? Do the parallels to the Scramble for Africa resonate with you, or do they obscure more than they reveal? What examples of successful African agency have you seen? Or, alternatively, what warning signs concern you most? This is an ongoing conversation, and your perspectives, especially those from people directly affected by these dynamics, are invaluable for all of us trying to understand what's actually happening. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.